Hello, students. So you listened and read the story about the Baroni family. In the Baroni family story, right, it talked about how often they go shopping and what things they usually do and what things they usually buy. So the story talked about the frequency, how often they do things. We're going to look at the grammar of frequency. For example, this sentence, they always drink tea with lunch. Answering the question, how often do they drink tea with lunch? They always drink tea with lunch. So frequency words. First, we have always. For example, Mary always eats lunch at school. Always is 100% of the time. So every time. So Mary eats lunch at school every day. She always eats lunch at school. So 100% of the time, we say always. Mary always eats lunch at school. Next, we have usually. Mary usually eats lunch at school. Usually is 90 to 99% of the time. That is a lot. But it is not always. It is close to always. It is next to always. So for example, with eating lunch at school, maybe out of 5 days, she may eat lunch 4 days, right? Or if you're talking about 7 days of a week, maybe she eats lunch 6 of the days. So that is Mary usually eats lunch at school. Next, we have often. For example, Josh often eats hamburgers. So often is 75 to 90% of the time. Right? So if we are looking at the week, there are 7 days in the week. Often would be 4 or 5 days in the week. Right? So Josh often eats hamburgers. Right? That's 75 to 90% of the time. Often. Next, we have sometimes. Right? Sometimes is 25 to 75%. It's the biggest group. Tia sometimes eats lunch at school. So sometimes is saying some of the time yes and some of the time no. It could be like 50-50, about half of the time, or a little more, or a little less. It's a little like saying so-so, right? How do you feel so-so? In the middle. So Tia sometimes eats lunch at school. Next we have seldom. Tia seldom eats lunch at school. This is a very small amount, right? 5 to 10%, right? So the word seldom, many people don't use the word seldom, right? It's less common, but you can use it. Tia seldom eats lunch at school. So maybe one time a week or one time, excuse me, one time in the month. Seldom. Next, we have rarely, right? Eva rarely washes her car. So rarely can be even smaller than seldom, but also is very similar to seldom. Rarely is 1 to 10%. And we say the word rarely more than the word seldom. So Ava rarely washes her car, meaning that she does not wash it often at all. It's a very small amount of the time. Let's say maybe one day a month or one day a year, very small amount. Ava rarely washes her car. And finally, we have never, 0%. Jay never goes to the zoo. So not one time, not ever, never is 0%. So always is 100%, all the time, every time. Never is 0%, not one time, not ever. Right? So always and never are very strong to say. Excuse me. Usually is very close to always. Rarely is very close to never. Also, seldom is very close to never. Right? Sometimes is in the middle. So let's go over those words again, and you can listen and repeat. Always, always. Usually, usually. Often, often. Sometimes, sometimes. Seldom, seldom. Rarely, rarely. Never, never. Let's listen and repeat the sentences. A. Mary always eats lunch at school. Okay, B. Mary usually eats lunch at school. C. Josh often eats hamburgers. Tia sometimes eats lunch at school. Tia seldom eats lunch at school. F. Ava rarely washes her car. G. Jay never goes to the zoo. Okay, if you need to, you can repeat this activity and listen again. If you feel ready to practice, you can click on the blue arrow to the right to continue and try the practice. If you look at the question, right? Talia, feeds her dog. And we can see Sunday, she feeds her dog. Monday, she feeds her dog. Tuesday, she feeds her dog. Wednesday, she feeds her dog. On Thursday, she feeds her dog. On Friday, she feeds her dog. On Saturday, she feeds her dog. So she feeds her dog every day. So how often does she feed her dog? Always, usually, often, sometimes, seldom, rarely, or never. How often does Talia feed her dog? What did you say? Yes, so always, right? Talia always feeds her dog. Every time that there's a day, she feeds her dog. Good job. Okay, let's look at the next question. How did you do? Tim, takes his children to school. He takes his children to school on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Is that every day? Is that always? How often does Tim take his children to school? It is not every day. So we could say that Tim sometimes takes his children to school. He takes his children to school on Monday, but he doesn't take his children to school on Tuesday. He takes his children to school on Wednesday, but he doesn't take his children to school on Thursday. He does take his children to school on Friday, so 3 days a week. So sometimes, Tim sometimes takes his children to school. Jara, watches TV. When does she watch TV? Only on Saturday. So, what can you say? Jara seldom watches TV is okay. You could also say Jara rarely watches TV. So Jara seldom watches TV or Jara rarely watches TV. She only watches TV one time a week, one day. So not all the time and not sometimes. She rarely watches TV. So now, what about Luke? How often does Luke cook dinner? You can see Luke cooks dinner almost every day. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday. He does not cook dinner on Friday. So, how often does he cook dinner? Always, usually, often, sometimes? Not always, almost. There's one day a week he does not. So we can say that he usually cooks dinner. Luke usually cooks dinner, right? Remember, usually is close to always. It's almost always. How often does Mary go to the movies? Do you see the calendar? There are no checks. So, how often does Mary go to the movies? Well, Mary never goes to the movies. That's an easy one there, right? She never goes to the movies. What about Cesar and Carlos? Cesar and Carlos, how often do they play soccer in the park? So you see, they play soccer on Monday, on Wednesday, and on Friday. How many days is that? 3 out of 7. So we can say that Cesar and Carlos sometimes play in soccer in the park. It's about 50-50, right? So Cesar and Carlos sometimes play soccer in the park. So what about Mary? How often does Mary eat breakfast before she brushes her teeth? If you look at the calendar, we see every day is checked. So, how often does Mary eat breakfast before she brushes her teeth? What can we say? Yes, always. Mary always eats breakfast before she brushes her teeth. Remember, always is 100% of the time, all the time, every day. So Mary always eats breakfast before she brushes her teeth. So now, what about Musad? How often does Musad cook dinner? We see that Musad cooks dinner on Sunday, he cooks dinner on Wednesday, and he cooks dinner on Saturday. How many days? 3. 3 out of the 7 days. So how often does Musad cook dinner? Yes, sometimes. Musad sometimes cooks dinner. Remember, sometimes it's about 50-50. So now, what about Jennifer? How often does Jennifer walk to work? We can see that only Wednesday she walks to work. So how often is that? For this one, there are 2 answers you could say. You could say that Jennifer seldom walks to work, or you could say that Jennifer rarely walks to work. Remember, rarely and seldom are very similar. They are almost never, but they are not never. So Jennifer rarely walks to work, or Jennifer seldom walks to work. What about this one? Juan. How often does Juan take the bus? We can see Juan takes the bus on Monday, he takes the bus on Tuesday, and Wednesday, and Friday. How many days is that? That's 4. That's 4 days out of 7. So, how often does Juan take the bus? We would say that Juan often takes the bus. We do not say usually, because usually is almost always. So we would need 2 more days for this to be usually. Now, what about sometimes? Could we say sometimes here? Yes, I think we could also say sometimes. So if you say sometimes, I would say that is okay. You could say Juan sometimes takes the bus. Okay, now you can continue on to the other practice with the frequency words.